thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Maisie. I am the outreach coordinator here at the Milwaukee Public Museum, and we are so excited to have Professor Jeffrey McKinnon here with us today. He is a professor at East Carolina University, but he actually has roots in Wisconsin. Before he was there, he was a professor at UW-Whitewater. So we're so excited to have him talking about ancient lakes today. And so I just want to give a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So this is just a reminder that this is best suited for grades 6 to 12, but anyone is welcome to join. We are really happy to have anybody here. The program will run about an hour, give or take, and there is an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you are on Zoom, we are going to be using the Q&A function. And if you are on YouTube, I encourage you to log in using a YouTube account, and you can ask questions right in the chat in YouTube. So again, I am super excited to introduce you to Professor Jeffrey McKinnon, and he's going to talk to us today all about ancient lakes, and I'm really excited. So Dr. McKinnon, please take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Maisie. I'm so pleased to be able to talk to you today about this great passion of mine that I've learned a lot more about recently while preparing a book that appeared just a few months ago with MIT Press called Our Ancient Lakes and Natural History that I spent a few years working on. So let's begin by thinking about what an ancient lake is. And I'm going to pose a few questions to the audience. I'm not going to be able to hear you respond, but you can think about what your answers are to some of these. And we'll do this once or twice as we go through today's presentation. So which of these is an ancient lake? Is Lake Michigan an ancient lake? Well, Lake Michigan is big and it's deep and it covers a lot of surface area, has a lot of fish in it. So it's a magnificent lake, but it's actually not as old as you might think. So Lake Michigan, like many lakes in Canada and in the northern US, actually was formed around 10 or 12,000 years ago when the glaciers that once covered that area retreated, and they left some depressions as they moved out, and they also left a lot of water. And that's how we got lakes like Lake Michigan. So many of the world's lakes, an awful lot of them, are that sort of age. And most lakes, in fact, will fill in with mud and silt in a fairly short period of time, thousands or 10,000s of years, short geologically. Let's look at another one, Lake Tanganyika. Perhaps you've heard of that. Do you think that might be an ancient lake? It turns out it is. Lake Tanganyika is a lake in Africa that we're going to talk about a little bit more today, and it is about 10 million years old. So it is one of the world's very oldest lakes, so many times as old as Lake Michigan. Lake Victoria, that's a different African lake. This one's even more famous than Tanganyika for all kinds of reasons. What do you think? Lake Victoria, we spent a lot of time on in the book. I won't be able to spend as much time on it today because Lake Victoria is kind of curious. It's in a depression, a little, depression in the earth, in Africa, not so far from Tanganyika. And that depression is quite old. It's about 400,000 years old, so maybe 40 times as old as the depression that Lake Michigan is in. But that depression has sometimes had water in it and sometimes not. So about 20,000 years ago, it mostly dried out. There were some swamps and ponds left, but the lake itself kind of disappeared. And then it reformed about 15,000 years ago. So Victoria is kind of complicated. And it turns out that Victoria is interesting because it's had this funny history, but it still has an awful lot of unique animals living in it, a little bit like places like Tanganyika. So how do we get really old lakes? Lakes that last a long time, longer than the ones that are the result of, say, glaciers or maybe just a deep part of a river accumulating a bit of extra water and forming what we might call a lake. We get that these longer-lived lakes through processes involving the Earth's crust, through what we call tectonic processes, where here we might see one chunk of the Earth's crust sinking down between two others, and that would create a depression. If there's water around, that can create a lake. And so even if this starts to fill in with mud over time, if it keeps sinking down, it can last a very long time, millions or tens of millions of years. Or one piece of the Earth's crust slips down alongside another one, that can also create very long-lived depressions, which can accumulate water, and we end up with lakes that can last for a very long time. So most of the ancient lakes are the result of these kinds of processes, rather than just, say, glaciers retreating or a river slowing down a little bit. When we have these sorts of lakes formed that last for really long periods of time, that allows time for an awful lot of evolution to take place. And we can end up with species that are found nowhere else in the world, sometimes often just in that one single lake. So these lakes can be a little bit like islands in the ocean. And here is an example of a peculiar creature found in a lake in Indonesia, where I've done a lot of work. Indonesia is between China and Australia in the Pacific Ocean. And this crab looks like it belongs in the ocean, doesn't it? It's actually quite large, several inches across. And you see it has huge claws. These are even longer than its body. And these crabs, although they look like they belong in the ocean, have actually evolved into several different species in these lakes in Indonesia. And there are some similar ones in Africa in Lake Tanganyika. And these guys eat clams, like you can see here, and also snails. So they have these huge claws that help them to eat these prey with really hard shells. Also in Indonesia, in Lake Matano, we have 10 or 15 distinct species in some of the lakes, species of fish, in addition to lots of other special animals. And they're often brilliantly colored, and we see this in lots of ancient lakes. Sometimes there are far more species than that. So they're diverse, lots of different animals, and they're beautiful to look at. This picture looks like it could easily have been shot in the ocean, but these are all lake fish. And just a few miles away, less than 20 miles away in Lake Tawudi, we have another group of species of fish, almost completely different, with almost no species the same between Lake Tawudi and less than 20 miles away, excuse me, Lake Matano, all very beautiful, but completely distinct. And none of these fish are found anywhere else in the world. So these are very special and remarkable places. This is a lake in Africa, and these are cichlid fish, which are really popular fish for people who keep home aquaria. They're pretty and they do well at home, and they're bred by lots of breeders all over the world now. But these ones from the African lakes are especially popular. And so these Lake Malawi fish, as you can see, again, have lots of different colors, and they make their living in the lake in lots of different ways. Some eat algae off the rocks, like you can see here. Some eat other fish whole. Some just bite the scales off other fish. And some even ram mother fish and knock the eggs out of their mouths, because the mothers are carrying the eggs around in their mouths, and then they eat the eggs. So they have all kinds of different ways of making a living, all kinds of different colors, and many, many different species in some of these African lakes. It's not just the fish that are pretty and diverse. There are many animals that have evolved into distinct forms, often very attractive ones in some of the lakes. Here's a shrimp from one of the Indonesian lakes, very elegant. Here's another one, these Atayid shrimps, and some of these are quite popular with aquarists, which can create a problem if people collect too many from the lakes and export them. Here's another one that I especially like because it has these elegant orange stripes along it, but also these really strangely colored, I think those are eggs that it's carrying along in the bottom of its body that look like somebody photoshopped them in, but they're natural, I'm assured by my colleagues. These pretty little guys are gammarids or amphipods, and these are from Lake Baikal, which is a far northern lake in Russia. And they are related to animals that some of the folks in the audience might have used as bait, or scuds, that you use to catch trout and other things. But in Lake Baikal, they aren't just the little gray or brown creatures that we see in North American streams. You can see some really pretty ones in the shallow waters there. And in the deeper waters, you have many different species. So there's over 250 species of these gammarids in Lake Baikal, which is quite a remarkable number. In addition to the small animals and the fish, there are also some large predators that one comes across in some of the lakes. This is a saltwater crocodile of the sort that you might see in some of the Indonesian lakes. They are not as exciting for biologists because they don't differ so much and they don't evolve into so many different species like we see the fish do. But they are impressive, and they're certainly something that you have to pay attention to if you're going to work in some of these lakes. Saltwater crocodiles, unfortunately, are one of the animals that's especially fond of trying to make a meal out of a person. So you probably haven't heard so much about ancient lakes in the popular media or even in your science classes, but you probably have heard of some other types of habitat that have a lot of species in them. So tropical rainforests have lots of different animals that are found only in the rainforest. Coral reefs, of course, have many, many different types of fishes and other animals living on them. Ancient lakes are in some ways a freshwater equivalent of these systems on land and in the ocean, or at least a rough equivalent. And yet we haven't heard so much about them. They just never seem to have gotten the attention on television and YouTube and other places from people like David Attenborough, who's a popular TV presenter about natural history. So they haven't gotten quite as much attention, which I think is a shame. So how did I discover ancient lakes, given that they weren't getting so much press in the media? It was kind of by accident. When I was very young, I came across them. So I had an uncle, my Uncle Jack, one of my favorite uncles, a really fun guy. And he worked in a mine right here in northern Canada, where a lot of my family is from. And that's kind of way to the north and a ways to the west of Wisconsin. My Uncle Jack and my Uncle Brent and their families worked in this mine there. And then in the late 1970s, they were asked by the nickel company that they worked for to move their whole families to a remote spot in Indonesia and work on starting a mine there. And so they did that. And here is the mine, this big nickel mine in Indonesia. And here is Lake Matano, just right next to it, this very deep lake that turns out to have interesting animals in it. Now, I, at that time, didn't have a lot of money, but I had cheap airline tickets because my father was a pilot. He flew airplanes for a Canadian airline. And so I could travel cheaply. So I went and stayed with my Uncle Jack and my Uncle Brent in Indonesia at their house. And while I was there, I was just starting university that time. This was in the 1980s. And while I was there, I went and collected insects out of the forest for the university I was at, the University of British Columbia. And I asked people, is there anything interesting in the lake? Should I go and look at the fish there? And people told me, nah, there's nothing much there. Go down to the coast and see the coral reefs and see the fish in those. Those are really exciting. So that I took their word for it. And I didn't really spend a lot of time trying to look at fish in the lake on that trip, but I sure liked the place. And so later I went on to become a scientist and made a career studying these stickleback fish all over the Europe and Northern Asia and North America. And I worked on these guys, but I always thought about this lake in Indonesia. And so when I came across a book in which I learned that, in fact, what people had told me was not true, there were really interesting fish in those lakes, I decided to go back. And so I returned to Lake Matano, which is shown here, and Lake Tawudi, shown here, working mainly in Lake Matano with a graduate student, Suzanne Gray, who worked with me, and a couple of other people, including my friend Fadli Tantu, an Indonesian scientist. And we just had the most marvelous time. We'd swim around in the lake with a video camera, recording what the fish were doing, trying to understand their behavior and measure their color and the light, and understand how all these interesting color patterns evolved in those systems. So we published a bunch of scientific papers, kind of did what we were supposed to do, and really enjoyed ourselves. But the whole time, things were changing around us. So the nickel company was bringing more and more people in. It was building roads. And here you can see a dam that it also built in the area. And that was the second dam it had built. And we got really concerned about how all these changes would affect the animals that lived there. So myself and Peter Hehanusa, another Indonesian scientist, we would talk to the people running the mine and say, maybe we could slow things down a little bit or do things a little bit differently. But we didn't manage to change their activities too much. We did work with them to do some local education. So we produced some posters and gave some presentations to schools and other groups in the area talking about the problems of releasing animals in the lake. So this is a relative of the piranhas that we found in the lake that somebody released. Here's another African cichlid fish. So we tried to educate people about these problems, and we probably did some good, probably prevented some introductions. But we couldn't stop all of them, and eventually a really bad one occurred. This is a flowerhorn cichlid fish. This is a fish that was bred to be kept in aquaria. Very pretty. You don't see the colors really well there, but a pretty fish that people really like to keep in tanks. But somebody released their pets into the lake, which is one of the worst things you can do with your pets. So we all want to avoid doing that. And this animal is eating all kinds of different things, snails and clams and other fish, and just really disrupting the lake and getting really to really, really high numbers in the lake, so causing serious problems. And I would hear from my colleagues working in other parts of the world all over that they were seeing similar difficulties in lakes that they worked on. And so a lot of us became really concerned about the fate of these lakes. And so I thought, well, maybe what I should do is try and publicize their situation more broadly. Maybe I should write a book that people could read and learn about ancient lakes. And so I had this idea almost 15 years ago, and I was getting ready to start work on it. And then I got asked to take on a new job here in North Carolina and be kind of like a principal for a university department and be the administrator. Once I started doing that, I did not have time for book writing. So that book got put on hold for quite a long time. But a few years ago, I returned to it when I gave up that administrative work. And so I've learned all kinds of marvelous things about the lakes in preparing that book. And what I want to do now is give you a little tour of the lakes to give you an overview of the different animals that live there and the different places in which they're found. So let's begin with Lake Baikal. So Lake Baikal is found here in Russia, actually in Siberia, which you might have heard of. It's a famously cold and wild place. And Lake Baikal is noteworthy amongst people who study lakes because it is the world's largest lake, contains about 20% of all the fresh water on the surface of the earth. And it is the deepest, and it is probably the oldest. So Lake Baikal, we think, in its earliest form, a little different from how it is now, about 70 million years old. And so when it first formed, it probably had dinosaurs like this Amurasaurus living on its shores. Today, there are no more dinosaurs, except for some birds, which are dinosaurs in a way. But there is another really interesting mammal living there, which is this Baikal seal, the Nerpa. And that is the only entirely freshwater species of seal found in the world. Lake Tanganyika, we mentioned already, lots of different groups have evolved into many different species there. I want to highlight these cichlids. We mentioned those already as being a problem in Indonesia. But in Africa, they are not so much a problem as just a really interesting case study in evolution. So in Lake Tanganyika, you have 240 or more species of cichlid fish, which is an extraordinary number. And those have all evolved in the last 10 million years. In a nearby lake, Malawi, which is found here, and that's where we saw the picture, Lake Malawi has even more. It's not as old. Lake Malawi is pretty old by our standards. It's 1 million years old, but of course that's much younger than, say, Baikal or Tanganyika. But it has over 800 species of cichlid fish in it, which is an astonishing number. That is more, for example, than there are species of mammals like bats and mice and deer and so on in the whole USA. So there are more cichlid fish in this one lake that's only 1 million years old in Africa than there are mammals in the whole USA that have had tens of millions of years to evolve their diversity here. So it's an extraordinary place. Finally, Lake Victoria amongst the African lakes is that really interesting one I mentioned before because it's young, and yet it too has a lot of cichlids in it, something like 500 species until recently. Here is where the Indonesian lakes are that I mentioned, right here in Sulawesi, which is between Australia and China's up here. And we have lots of different groups that have diversified in these lakes. Lake Titicaca, I want to mention because it's an especially high ancient lake. It is found in the Andes Mountains on the border of Peru and Bolivia. And here also you have amphipods that have diversified. They're not exactly gammarids, but they're related, and snails and pupfish. And then in the Caspian Sea, shown here, that is also thought of by lake scientists as a lake because it doesn't have any direct connection to the world's oceans. So sometimes there are bodies of water that have salt in them that we refer to as lakes, or like the Great Salt Lake in Utah, because they have no direct connection to the oceans. But they're not fresh water; they're actually salty. Okay, I can take a little break there and answer a few questions if folks have them.
Excellent, wonderful. So I'm going to give us a couple minutes to type in some questions. So to start us out, the educator in me would like to ask you, you mentioned biodiversity and you talked about introduced fish species and why that might be a threat or a problem. So can you explain a little bit about why biodiversity is so important?
Wow, that's a great question. So I think fundamentally what we want to keep in mind is that there's different types of, environmental problems that we have. So we might have, for example, a lot of mercury in some body of water. That can be a bad thing. It can make people sick. But you can get your water from potentially other places, or you can clean out the mercury. There's things you can do to fix that. It's a problem that can be solved. But the thing about biodiversity is that when it comes to biodiversity, what we're worried about, and biodiversity really means places where there are it's basically lots of species is the way that people usually think about it. So places that have lots of species, the thing that worries us is when there are extinctions. And extinction is a little bit different from, a bit of pollution someplace. They can be related, but it's a little bit different because extinctions are forever. So it often took thousands or millions or many millions of years to evolve some species or some set of species. So if we lose them, we've lost permanently in a way that we can never get back. The result of millions of years of nature's labors, you might say. And many animals have evolved to do all kinds of interesting and important things. And sometimes they have genes that we might want to use, say, for agriculture or for biotechnology. And so we lose access to those when they go extinct. So that's a big deal. Another one is that natural systems provide many important services to us. So, for example, a lot of our crops, a lot of the food that we eat relies upon pollinators that go out and move pollen around and cause these plants to fruit and produce fruits and vegetables. And when we lose those native organisms, we often lose the ability to get those crops pollinated. And so that can be a disaster, right? And that can really affect what we have to eat. And then, there's also just our quality of life. Most of us find a lot of joy and satisfaction and peace in nature. And so when we lose nature, we lose that. There are other reasons, but these are some of the big ones.
Thank you. We teach a program about biodiversity. So I would just like to talk about why it's so important.
Yeah, thanks.
So we've got a couple of questions. I'm actually going to start because you just recently talked about a saltwater lake. And
Yeah.
so CV in Zoom is wondering, how do some lakes become saltwater?
The main thing seems to be that they often have very little water flowing out of them. So that it means if water is flowing down through rocks and minerals and collecting salts and bits of rock and minerals, it flows down into the lake. If water flows out of the lake, those salts and other materials can be carried away, and then new fresh water replaces it from the rain. But when there's nothing being carried away, then it's really easy for the salt to just accumulate to higher levels. And so that's one of the main reasons. It can depend too on what sort of water the inflow or what sort of material the inflow is coming through, if it's coming through really salty lands or not. But I think the main thing is how much water is moving out of them.
Awesome. That's really interesting. I had no idea. Thank you,
Yeah.
CV, for asking that question. All right. The next question I have is from Samuel on YouTube. And they're wondering, so how do animals get into lakes in the first place? If lakes are formed, maybe with glaciers, or we talked about Lake Michigan, or the movement of tectonic plates. How do animals get in those lakes?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question because some lakes are pretty hard to get to. So if you have a lake high in the mountains, it may be, for example, that it's very difficult for fish to get to it. And so you may only have things like tadpoles or insect larvae in a lake like that, because there's just no way for the fish to get there, although they're surprisingly good at getting to even very remote places. But usually the way they get there is through streams and rivers. And sometimes if there's a major river system that already had quite a few different species of fish in it, if that connects to the lake, then fish can colonize the lake from that river, but they can evolve within the lake to have traits that make them better suited to the ecology of the lake and the conditions in the lake, which are quite different from what you get in rivers. And so in the course of adapting to the conditions in the lake, they might evolve into new species. And then in different parts of the lake, at different depths or in different locations, they might evolve into many different species. So that's one way. And then the other way, with a lot of the post-glacial lakes, the lakes that have appeared since the glaciers retreated in in North America, like in much of Canada, in Western Canada, where I grew up, a lot of those lakes have never been connected to a major river. They've just had small streams leading from the ocean to them. And so sometimes marine fish that can survive a little bit in fresh water will colonize the freshwater lake and adapt to fresh water and evolve into new forms in the lake. And then, of course, there are species that live in fresh water sometimes, in the ocean sometimes, and those move back and forth. And those are really good at colonizing these lakes that are in remote places that are really only connected to the ocean. And often they evolve into new species there.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. I think that we're good on questions for this section. So we're excited. Let's move on.
Okay. So I want to tell you next about some of what ancient lakes are teaching us, and research in ancient lakes is teaching us about the causes of all this diversity, all these different species that we see in nature, and also about the different forms that traits can take within a single species. So, for example, in our own species, one way that a single trait can vary a lot is in eye color, because we can have blue eyes and gray eyes and green eyes and brown eyes. And so we've all seen that kind of variation. And lots of traits show such variation, even though it may be in features of fish that might be quite different from what we usually think about. And so I wrote a chapter in the book on this about how ancient lakes are informing our understanding of what maintains all these different forms of traits in natural systems. And it's got kind of a funny title: Cricket, Cabers, and the Sinister Advantage. So cricket and caber tossing are sports. And so what's kind of fun and I think helpful in terms of understanding things is to compare the processes that take place in certain sports with those that take place in Lake Tanganyika in particular, but in other lakes as well, that cause different feeding traits to evolve in fish. And so here's something you might think about. Which of these sports do you think might be most similar to what goes on in Lake Tanganyika in the fish evolution? Caber tossing, folks may or may not have heard of that. That's a Scottish sport where people take this great big log and throw it end over end. And this fellow's wearing a kilt, which is a traditional type of dress in Scotland. So is that like what happens in Lake Tanganyika? Or maybe swimming? That sort of makes sense, right? That swimming would be like what fish do. But it turns out that the sport that is most similar in terms of how feeding traits evolve is cricket, which is a lot like baseball. So in cricket, there's a bowler, he's like a pitcher, and he throws a ball. And then there's another person who tries to use a wooden bat, just like in baseball, to keep that ball from hitting the wickets, these sticks. So it's very similar to baseball. And that's a bit surprising, isn't it? That this sport would be like what happens in an ancient lake. But let me explain. This is a scale eater. Its name is Pericidus. It's a cichlid, but the name isn't the main thing. This fish makes its living by biting the scales off of other fish. So what they do is they swim up behind another fish, usually a bigger one. And then as they get close, they eventually come in from behind and from the side, because they don't want to be seen, right? They come in from one side and they turn their heads and bite a chunk of flesh, scales mainly, off of the prey. So they make their living eating the scales off of other fish. The prey fish swims away and survives. It's not very happy. because it's lost some scales, but it'll survive. And then they swim off. And it's hard to grab the scales off of that prey fish. And so they have evolved different mouth shapes to do that. So the scale eaters, at least some of the species, have evolved mouths which are twisted. So this one is attacking its prey fish from the right side, and so its mouth is twisted to the left. Okay, and so it's got a mouth which helps it get a good grasp of the scales of its prey very quickly, because of course the prey is going to try and swim away. So imagine what would happen if there was only this kind of right-handed scale eater in the lake. Well, the prey fish would all be watching, to the back. They might swim around in circles. They'd all be watching behind them to the right, wouldn't they? And so they'd be pretty good at watching out for these scale eaters. So if it's all right-sided scale eaters, righties they call them, in the lake, what happens if a mutant appears that bites from the left? Well, all the prey are watching off to the right, so that one coming from the left is going to have a really easy time biting the prey fish and getting a chunk of scales. So let's suppose now that the left ones become really common and become almost all lefties. Well, now the prey fish are watching to the left, and the ones that attack from the right should be really successful, shouldn't they? So we think that whichever form is rare is going to be the type that's most successful at any given time. As a result, over the long term, what we expect to see is that both types of scale eater will continue to exist in natural populations. So this kind of rare advantage can maintain different forms of traits in the same population. And one of my favorite ever field experiments was done on this system by this fellow, Adrian Indermayer, working in a laboratory in Switzerland in Lake Tanganyika. And this is he and I in Lake Tanganyika with the parasitus I'm holding there. You can see how small they are. And so Adrian is a great field worker, and working with Walter Salzberger and others, they built these enclosures on the bottom of Lake Tanganyika. So about 30 feet deep down in the bottom of this lake, they built these enclosures. And the enclosures were something like 5 feet or so on each side. And into each one, they put a standardized number, let's say 10 of prey fish. And then they also put a standardized number, let's say 10 of scale eaters. So in some of these enclosures, they put all righties. So all scale eaters that attack from the right. So 10 prey fish and 10 righties. In some of them, they put 10 prey fish and 10 lefties. And then in some of them, they put 10 prey fish and 5 righties with five lefties. So what they expected to see in their experiment, if there's an advantage to being the less frequent kind of scale eater, being rare, then when you have 2 different kinds, they should be more successful, because the prey fish can't just watch one side or just watch the other side, right? And so they're not going to be able to defend either side as well. And the scale eaters should be really successful and get a lot to eat. And that's what they found when they had 2 different types of scale eater in the enclosure. They got more to eat than when it was all righties or all lefties in this wonderful experiment on the bottom of Lake Tanganyika. And that helps us understand, that kind of experiment helps us understand how different forms of a trait are maintained in lots of different species and systems. I want to talk next about, I don't know, what might be my favorite lake. It's such a remarkable one, and that is Lake Baikal, which is known in Russia sometimes as the blue eye of Siberia. And it's celebrated in Russian literature by people like the great writer Anton Chekhov. Here is one of the most famous scientists who worked on Lake Baikal. That's Mikhail Kozov. And he started working there in about 1945. And he began this long study, this long-term ecological study, where he would go out every 10 days or a little bit longer or so, and he would collect standardized samples from one particular spot in the lake. So all summer and fall, he would go out in a boat and drop down instruments to different depths and collect samples of water and be able to look at the chemistry of the water and of tiny animals and tiny plants living in the water column. And you get these wonderful samples. He preserved these for the long term. He'd go back and analyze them in his laboratory. And he did that for decades. And he didn't just do it in the summer. He also went out in the wintertime when the lake was covered in ice. So then he had to walk out or else drive out, drill a hole in the ice, kind of like going ice fishing, and lower down his equipment to exactly the same spot in the lake. And he kept doing this, all winter in all kinds of different conditions. And he did it for decades, even as Russia was changing and the world was changing around him. And then when he got too old to collect these samples, his daughter took over the project. Her name is Olga Kozova. And she became a professor at the same university, at Irkutsk State University, and she did it for decades. And then when she finished, her daughter, Lyubov Izmestova, who I know a little bit, I've corresponded with, she took over the project and kept it going still longer. So from 1945 until Lyubov Izmestova retired just a couple of years ago, this family was collecting these samples in Lake Baikal all winter, all summer, year after year after year. And now some of their colleagues and former students have taken over the project and are still collecting these samples. And this is helping us to understand things like global warming and how climate change is affecting the lake and how other changes around the lake are probably affecting it. So it's really, really important work. I'm not going to tell you too much further about the results of their studies, but what I do want to tell you is just what an extraordinary and even strange place Lake Baikal is. So here is a photo that was taken underwater in Lake Baikal. And when I show this to scuba divers who've spent a lot of time in the ocean, they say, well, that must be a picture of the ocean. But it's not. It's a freshwater lake. And this is very different from any lake we would ever see in North America, for example. So these sponges can be 4 feet tall, and they have algae living inside them that are turning sunlight into useful food for the sponges and for the algae, because they're a type of plant. And between about 20 or 30 and 50 or 60 feet deep in Lake Baikal, these sponge forests are very abundant and cover huge areas of the bottom of the lake. They're actually under quite a lot of stress right now, but they have been a tremendous and impressive densities for a very long time in the lake. All right, another extraordinary feature of the lake is the types of fish that have evolved into new species in that lake and the odd forms that they have taken. So I want to ask you this question to start us thinking about these Baikal fish. Which of these do you think would have the most fat in it? Which of these would be the fattiest? Would it be this fish, which is a sculpin from Lake Baikal, an odd-looking fish, isn't it? See its long fins? It's called a golemyanka, or cheddar cheese, or brie, or hamburger. Which of these would have the most fat? Turns out cheddar is just about the fattiest cheese, 33%. But it has less fat in it than a golemyanka does. So that is a curious state of affairs, isn't it? Why might this fish have so much fat in its body? And it doesn't have fat in the sense of being obese, but its tissues have very high levels of oils and fats in them. It's basically because it's a sculpin, and sculpins are not well suited to living in the open waters of lakes. In most places, sculpins live on the bottom of lakes and streams and the ocean. They look something like this, and they sit there. They never swim up very high. And as a result, they don't need any way to maintain their buoyancy in the water column. So most fish have something called a swim bladder, which is kind of a gas-filled sac inside their bodies, and they can put more or less gas into it to keep them level in the water. So they never have to spend any effort keeping themselves at the same spot in the water. They don't rocket to the surface or sink to the bottom. But a sculpin will naturally just sink to the bottom, right? So if it wants to live in the open waters of Lake Baikal, which is thousands of feet deep, and not just sink to the bottom, it needs some way to do that. And so what it does is it accumulates a lot of fat and lipid and oil in its tissues, in the case of the golemyanka. And the fat makes it tend to float, because oil will usually float on top of water, right? So that makes it float because it's lighter. So that's their way to compensate for not having a swim bladder. They also tend to have very light bones, so they don't have all that heavy material that's going to cause them to sink. And so you end up with these fish, which are very poorly suited, really, to living in the open water, managing to do so through this odd adaptation. And the final strange piece of Lake Baikal that I want to tell you about is that it has what you might call deep sea vents. Of course, it's not the sea, it's not an ocean, it's a lake. And these sorts of vents are common enough in the deep sea, and you have organisms living around them, all kinds of interesting animals, but it's unusual in lakes. The situation is that methane, this gas, is bubbling up from the same sorts of deposits that have oil and coal and that kind of thing in them. And bacteria can make their living from the methane. They can use it to power their metabolisms and make more bacteria. It's a different sort of process from what we see at the surface. At the surface, most of the energy comes from sunlight, and plants use that. Then we eat the plants. But here, the energy is coming from methane being utilized by bacteria. Now, in many lakes, it would stop there because the bottom of many lakes has no oxygen in it, or very little oxygen. And so things like fish and amphipods, gammarids, they can't live there because there's not enough oxygen for them. But Baikal, because it has a circulation that keeps water moving around it, and for other reasons, tends to have quite a bit of oxygen, even very deep in the lake. And as a result, other animals can eat the bacteria, which gives rise to a whole food chain, a whole ecosystem. And these animals are getting their energy from these bacteria who are getting it from the methane. And that means that deep in Baikal, where sunlight never penetrates, and the environment hardly ever changes at all from season to season because it's so deep, over a mile deep. Deep in Baikal, you can get creatures like these. This is a sculpin that has almost no coloration to it, right? It's like a deep sea fish, and it's tiny little eyes because it's adapted to live in a place where there's no light, and it's getting its energy from the methane. And you get flatworms, these kind of shocking creatures that can be over a foot long that are predatory. So these worms will eat things like sculpins and other prey. You see how enormous it is, right? So they're giant animals by the standards of these deep Baikal systems, and they're predatory. So very strange things going on in the depths of Baikal. I'm gonna say a little bit about what's going on in the lakes now. I've mentioned already the problems we were seeing in Indonesia, and I want to let you know that in some lakes these problems are even more serious. And so I wrote a chapter on this to finish the book. Probably the saddest case is Lake Lanao. It's an ancient lake in the Philippines where at one time there were 18 species of fish found nowhere else in the world. Lake Lanao has been disrupted by new species being added to it, by all kinds of other environmental changes, caused mainly by people, we think. And as a result, it looks like about 16 of those fish have now gone extinct and are entirely lost. In terms of the condition of the lake itself, the Aral Sea, which is in fact a lake for the reasons we talked about before, is an even sadder case. So in the Aral Sea in 1960, and the Aral Sea is millions of years old, it had an area like this, quite a large lake. But as agriculture built up around it, especially for cotton, so as people were growing a lot of cotton, they were using all the water before it got to the lake to irrigate the cotton. And so the lake just didn't have enough water coming into it, and it shrank and shrank and shrank. And it had all kinds of other stresses as well. So the Aral Sea is now, hardly a sea at all. It's nearly dry. So these are extreme cases, but we see these sorts of things going on in many of the lakes. And global warming, introduced invasive species, fertilizers causing algae blooms, water diversions. These are all causing extinctions in all of the lakes. In most of them, though, the number of extinctions is very small compared to, say, what happened in Lake Lanao. And so, they're still hanging in there. In addition to, the familiar problems that are caused when we have extinctions that we talked about a little bit earlier, in some of the ancient lakes, extinctions and disruptions to the systems cause really terrible short-term problems just in terms of people getting enough to eat. Some of these fisheries provide really important protein to people around the lakes, like in Lake Malawi and also in Lake Tanganyika, Lake Victoria, and others. So the extinctions that we're starting to see and the degradation of lakes that we're seeing can cause very swift and serious problems for the people living around the lakes. So I concluded the book by saying a little bit about what the prospects are for the lakes in the near future, because of course, our climate is changing, and human population is still growing, although it's probably not going to get too much larger than it is today. And we're continuing to cause environmental changes. So in light of all that, how do things look for the lakes? I won't say a lot about that, but I'll just sum up with my remarks from the book. So I said, with foresight and timely action, it is possible that much ancient lake biodiversity can endure the current difficult moment. So what I'm saying there is that I think things are tough right now, but if we take a few important steps, things may not turn out so badly. And I'm not sure I'm optimistic, but I am hopeful enough to have written this book. So what I'm saying there is that I don't think it's inevitable that things are going to get better and we're going to solve these problems, but I think we have a decent chance of doing so. A lot of people helped me with this project. I'm not going to go through all these names, but I just want to let you know that there've been a lot of folks who've helped with the book and with all the associated research. And I thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take more questions.
All right, excellent. I can start with a question from YouTube that came in when you were talking about the experiment you were doing. And the question asks, what is the hardest part about doing experiments underwater?
It depends on the experiment a little bit. One of the problems is just that when you do field work, you're kind of at the mercy of the weather. So if you get a storm or a bad day, or if the lake level changes a lot, then it can be really hard to do your work. So that can be a real problem. And then even if you can still get out in the lake, sometimes it gets so murky that you can't see anything because things have been stirred up so badly. So the vagaries of the weather can be a problem. And then sometimes keeping your equipment safe. If you're in a place where there's a lot of people passing by, or maybe fishermen are dragging nets, or in Africa, there might be hippopotamuses and crocodiles. So there's all these people and activities and creatures that can mess with your experiments. I think part of the reason they put those enclosures fairly deep in the lake was to avoid those sorts of disruptions. So those are some of the things that can be a challenge.
Who would have known that working in lakes, you might have to run into hippos?
Yeah, I've never worked in lakes with hippos, and in general, people avoid the spots where the hippos are because they're really dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be anywhere near a hippo, so I don't blame you for not working in one with hippo.
It does constrain where you can work.
I bet. All right, we have a few other questions in the Zoom, and I'm going to combine two of them. So one of the questions is, what's your favorite lake and why? And I think you may have said that you liked Lake Baikal.
Yeah, right? It's really hard to say. And the first one I went to, Lake Matano, is still very dear to my heart. I arrived there as a teenager, and so I love that place. And Tanganyika, I was only at for the first time about a year and a half ago, and it is magnificent. So it's really hard to pick one. But Baikal is a strange place, and so I appreciate its oddity.
Awesome. I think we have a question about Lake Baikal, which asks, like, how do fish stay warm in cold lakes, like the one in Russia, was the question.
That's such an interesting question. So colder water has some advantages for fish because it tends to have more oxygen in it. So that's good. So a problem we have sometimes in North America now is that as fresh waters are warming up, they're holding less oxygen. And so climate change is making things really hard for some fish because there's less oxygen. So cold water has some advantages, but the main thing is that they have evolved to do well in cold water. So animals over generations and long periods of time, the ones who are doing well in cold water, they leave more offspring the next generation. They're the ones who are flourishing. And so those genes that make them well suited to living in cold conditions, those are the ones that succeed and become common in those populations. So they're adapted to those conditions. If you take those Baikal fish and you move them to Lake Matano and Sulawesi, they'll die right away. So they just don't tolerate the hot water. At the same time, if you take warm water fish and move them to cold water, they'll be stressed. So if you ever bring a fish home to your house to put in an aquarium, If they're tropical fish, you let it get too cold, you might notice they get a disease called ick. They get sick. And that's because they get stressed by the cold water. So most animals have evolved to do well in certain conditions. And that's basically the answer.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. We have two more questions in Zoom, and I think they're both excellent. And so one of the questions actually brings us all the way back to the Great Lakes that you mentioned. And the question is, what is your favorite thing about the Great Lakes and why are they unique? I know that's not really too much what you study, but
No, but
you talked a little bit about it.
that's a neat question. You know, the Great Lakes are beautiful. So I just appreciate their simple beauty. They're wonderful places to go kayaking. My family likes to go sea kayaking. And so that's a lovely thing to do, for example, in Lake Superior. But now they're interesting. Oddly enough, they're interesting almost as an example of really disturbed systems. So the Great Lakes have many fish that were not native to them living there now. Species of salmon, as some of you may have caught from Great Lakes, are living there. And sea lampreys are established in them. And three-spined sticklebacks are in some of the lakes. This fish that I used to study in the Pacific and the Atlantic, they've been introduced, as well as the zebra mussels and other species of mussels. So the Great Lakes are kind of a case of what happens when you add a lot of new things into a place and see how it affects what lives there and how they interact. So they're kind of now a case study in what happens when you make a lot of changes to giant lake systems. And then you can study evolution in those as well. So all those animals that have arrived recently, they probably have a lot of evolving to do to become really well suited to those conditions. And then every time some new species arrives, they have to adjust to that one. So for an evolutionary biologist, they're kind of an interesting system because there's just so much change going on in them. That's sort of making lemonade out of a lemon, It'd be very nice if we hadn't disrupted them so badly. But I guess in some ways today, maybe that's one of the most interesting things about them.
Awesome. Great. All right. And then our last question, which I think is so excellent, because it was also a question that I was planning to ask you, but Benjamin beat me to it. They said, what is the best way to help protect our lakes?
So I think some of the best things we can do just for nature and for our planet are real simple. So we just need to stop using up so much space and resources and slow global warming. And we can do that if we do a couple of things. So the one is just to eat a lot less beef. It turns out that cattle require enormous resources to raise, and they produce a lot of gases that heat the planet. So if you can eat almost anything else, but a great thing to eat if you want to keep eating, some sort of animal proteins is clams and oysters and mussels. Those are really, really excellent choices. But really, if you just switch from beef to more chicken, that's a very positive step. And then if we can basically stop using fossil fuels so much, so that means, in a word, just making everything electric. If we can make the cars we drive electric, the way we heat our homes electric, make everything electric as much as possible, and get that electricity from renewable sources like the sun and the wind, even if we get it from atomic energy, that's going to be better than getting it from coal or from natural gas, which is also a fossil fuel. Natural gas was an important transitional energy, but it's not what we want to keep using. I'll add one other thing, and that is just never release a pet. You've seen how much harm that's caused in a lot of systems. So if we can just not move animals or plants around, not move zebra mussels between lakes and do everything we can to avoid more introductions and not releasing pets, that's a super positive thing.
All right, wonderful. This has been super fun. I've learned something because I always really love doing these programs because I always get to learn something too. So I want to thank you so much, and I'm going to ask us all to join in thanking Professor Jeff McKinnon for joining us today and teaching us so much about really cool ancient lakes and really cool animals in ancient lakes. And I want to thank all of you who are joining me today, maybe from home or from your classrooms. And if you do want to hear about more news related to this program, Learn with an Expert, or any of the other programs that we offer, you can sign up for our educator newsletter at npm.edu. Or if you want to learn more about our outreach programs, you can visit npm.edu/outreach. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of your Friday. Bye-bye.